Maybe we're just gonna, oop, hi.
What are you doing?
I was clipping it in. Sorry. Awkward.
Okay, before you get started, I'll say a couple of things. Just first to say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon to celebrate the U.S. publication of two of Helen Garner's books, The Children's Bach and This House of Grief. I'm Laurie Gilman. I'm the owner of East City Bookshop. And I have to ask just quickly, how many of you have been to East City Bookshop? Great, we love that. And we hope to see you there often. And if you haven't been, we are just down the street, literally 3 more blocks toward the Capitol on Pennsylvania Avenue. So very easy to get to, right by Eastern Market Metro. So we hope to see you there. And I have to give my quick spiel here. We have events every week. We have 14 store-sponsored book clubs. 3 of those are for kids and teens. We have community events. We have events that we partner with our other organizations with, school events. So please look us up on our website, eastcitybookshop.com, and sign up for our e-newsletter and follow us on all the social media. Okay, there's that part. So now I want to say thank you to all our friends at Hill Center. We've been partnering with them on events since we've opened, which is about 7.5 years now, and it's such a pleasure to work with them and so wonderful to have this beautiful historic space provided for our event today, so thank you. Okay, a couple of notes before we get started. Books are for sale just right outside the door, and remember that the thing that keeps publishers publishing authors you love is purchasing their books. So, and the thing that keeps independent bookstores in business is you purchasing the books from independent bookstores. So I encourage you, of course, to purchase from East City Bookshop or your favorite independent bookstore. And those of you who have already done so, thank you very much. The books, just to note, are already signed. Helen signed them before the event, so there won't be a signing line afterwards. So you can just pick up a book on your way out if you haven't done that already. And if you would please silence your cell phones before we get started. And we will have time for questions after the conversation. So if you have a question, just wait 1 second so that someone will bring you a mic, because this event is being recorded, so we want to be able to hear the audience questions. And I think that is all the notes that I have for you. All right, on to the main event. Helen Garner is the author of many novels, stories, screenplays, and works of nonfiction. In 2006, she received the inaugural Melbourne Prize for Literature, and in 2016, she won the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize for Nonfiction. In 2019, she was honored with the Australia Council for Lifetime Achievement in Literature. That's probably really the only thing you have to say as an introduction, right? To say just how well known Helen Garner is in Australia. In addition to The Children's Bach and This House of Grief, her books include Monkey Grip, The Spare Room, Everywhere I Look, and numerous others. And maybe we'll be able to hear more about plans for other books publications that will be coming out in the U.S. In conversation with Ms. Garner today is Lisa Lucas, Senior Vice President and Publisher of Pantheon and Schocken Books at Penguin Random House. Previously, she was Executive Director of the National Book Foundation for 5 years. Prior to joining the foundation, she served as publisher of Guernica, a nonprofit online magazine, Director of Education at the Tribeca Film Institute, on the development team at Steppenwolf Theater Company, and as a consultant for Sundance Institute, San Francisco Film Society, the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and Real Works Teen Filmmaking. She also serves on the Literary Council of the Brooklyn Book Festival. Please join me in welcoming Helen Garner and Lisa Lucas.
We have been on the road for the past week or so, maybe a little longer, because you had to come in from Australia.
I can't remember how many days it is.
And everybody else has been interviewing Helen, but I finally get my turn, and I'm very, very excited. This is a really special, we'll get to reading and we'll get to talking about Helen, but I just wanted to say, because I haven't had the opportunity at any of the events that we've had, that this is just a really special moment. You know, this is work that is so important in Australia and so important here to so many exceptional writers. It's the first and probably last time I will ever have writers begging me, literally asking me repeatedly to write introductions and forewords, and asking for galleys in an aggressive way, and just being so excited to be at these events and realizing how special it is that we get to see you here in the States. So it's really it's been a magical week, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about all of things writing and Helen. But before we do that, I think maybe we should just hear the words. So let's get started with a little reading from The Children's Bach and This House of Grief, which are the two books that we first published.
Yeah, these are the two books I'll be reading from and talking about today. And I'll start with this one. I'm just going to read like a page and a half of the first one so you can get used to my accent, if that's a problem. And first of all, okay, I better put my glasses on, hang on. I never thought that this would happen to me, that I would be published in America. It was never even my ambition. It was so far outside my consciousness. And it's so late in life that it takes me 5 minutes to get my glasses on and get the first page open. Okay, so this is the very opening of this novel. Dexter found in a magazine a photograph of the poet Tennyson, his wife, and their 2 sons walking in the garden of their house on the Isle of Wight. To the modern eye, it is a shocking picture. They are all, with the exception of the great man himself, bundled up in such enormous, incapacitating garments. Eye lines. Tennyson looks into the middle distance. His wife, holding his arm and standing very close to his side, gazes up into his face. One boy holds his father's hand and looks up at him. The other boy holds his mother's and looks into the camera with a weak, rueful expression. Behind them, out of focus, twinkles the windy foliage of a great garden. Their shadows fall across the lawn. They have just taken a step. Tennyson's hands are large, square paws held up awkwardly at stomach level. His wife's face is gaunt and her eyes are set in deep sockets. It is a photo of a family. The wind puffs out the huge, stiff, curved sleeve of the woman's dress and brushes back off his forehead the long hair of the father's boy, who is turned towards the drama of his parents' faces. Though he is holding his father's hand, he is separate from the group, and light shows between his tightly buttoned torso and his father's leg. Dexter stuck this picture up on the kitchen wall, between the stove and the bathroom door. It is torn and stained, and coated with a sheen of splattered cooking grease. It has been there a long time. It is always peeling off, swinging sideways, dangling by one corner. But always, before it quite falls off the wall, someone saves it. Someone sticks it back. That really is an image of what this book's about. And I've got to admit that I found it almost after I'd finished writing the book. I just came across the photo. I thought, my God, this is a photo of what I've just written a book about. So I'll put it in the book right up the front, on the front page, so everyone will know what the book's about. So now you can ask me some questions.
All right. Are you going to read from This House of Grief?
Oh, I thought you wanted to do that later.
Oh,
yeah, I can do it now.
Let's do it
Because
now.
this is the flip side of...
This is the flip side, yeah.
Now, flip side, that first one was like a happy family, and this is a different sort of family. This book is a non-fiction book. It's about a real murder case that happened not far from Melbourne, where I live, a few years ago. And this is just, let's see, this is just about a page and a half as well. Once there was a hard-working bloke who lived in a small Victorian country town with his wife and their 3 young sons. They battled along on his cleaner's wage, slowly building themselves a bigger house. One day, out of the blue, his wife told him that she was no longer in love with him. She did not want to go on with the marriage. She asked him to move out. The kids could live with her, she said, would live with her, and he could see them whenever he liked. She urged him to take anything he wanted from the house. The only thing she asked for and got was the newer of their 2 cars. The sad husband picked up his pillow and went to live with his widowed father several streets away. Before long, his wife was seen keeping company with the concreter they had hired to pour the slab for the new house. The tradesman was a born-again Christian with several kids and his own broken marriage. Soon the separated wife began to accompany him to his church. Next, the husband spotted the concreter driving around town in the car that he had slaved to buy. Up to this point, you could tell the story as a country and western song, a rueful tale of love betrayed, a little bit whiny, a little bit sweet. But 10 months later, just after dark on a September evening in 2005, while the discarded husband was driving his sons back to their mother from a Father's Day outing, his old white Commodore swerved off the highway, barely 5 minutes from home, and plunged into a dam. He freed himself from the car and swam to the bank. The car sank to the bottom and all the children drowned. I saw it on the TV news. Night, low foliage, water misty and black, blurred lights, a chopper, men in high-vis and helmets. Something very bad here, something frightful. Oh Lord, let this be an accident.
Thank you. So, you started off and you've said at each of the events that we've done, you didn't expect this to happen.
No,
right? And
I
so
did not.
It's a 2-part question in the sense that, one, what does it feel like to revisit these works in a new context? And then also, what does it feel like to have people reacting to them in new ways from another place to scale?
Well, the first, I should say, this first one, The Children's Bark, was written 40 years ago. I wrote that when I was about 40, less than 40. And so the first thing I can say about that is that there's nothing more wonderful as a writer than to find that your book is still interesting to people 40 years later. I mean, you imagine that your book comes out, it sells some copies, gets a few reviews and people buy it, and then you think, oh, well, I better go and write another one because I don't know how to do anything else. But then the years go by and you write some more books, and then somebody... the second one, the one about the murder trial, I wrote that only a few years ago. So that's a big gap in time between the 2 books. And suddenly an American publisher buys them. And here I am at the age of 80, sitting here thinking, oh, now I've got to talk about these books again. And I quite like talking about them, but people's reactions to them are I guess, more gratifying to me in another country. Because, back home, which is a small country, I mean, it's big in area, but it's not so many people in it. God, people know who I am, and I always imagine I write another book and they go, oh, here she goes again. She's written another one. So over here, everyone goes, wow, here's this new writer that we haven't heard of. I'm going, hey, this is all right.
And reading the pages themselves, do you feel like... I was talking to another writer who was reading something that they had written maybe 40 years beforehand, and they were hadn't looked at it, and they were like, oh my God, who was she?
Yeah.
Right? Who do you feel like in relationship to the Helen Garner that wrote, particularly The Children's Book, but also This House of Grief? I mean, these books change you in their processes. And
Yeah, they do. Oh, well, The Children's Book, see, I every time I've been interviewed about this book on this tour, I have said the same thing. I can't believe I wrote this book because it's actually good. And, I mean, it's good in a way that I don't know if I could do it now. It's a novel, and most of I shifted to non-fiction at a certain point of my life. And when I read that book again, which I only did because of coming over here, I thought, gee, this is actually quite good. And it's good in a way that I don't remember doing it. I don't remember what sort of person I was then. I mean, I do remember, but not as it's connected with the actual act of writing. I thought, how come I could write a book back then when I had a teenage daughter. I have just one child, and she was, I suppose, doing her final year of school at that point. And I was married to my second husband, nice guy. And so I don't think I was spectacularly happy or anything like that. It was just ordinary life going on. And somehow this book, it's better. I think it's better than my other books in certain technical ways. I think these sentences really work. And it feels like I'm in control the whole time. But I think that's just an illusion. Because when I was trying to write a later book, one day I was I always had this idea that children's bark, I must have, poured it out in a gracious stream and without torturing myself. And one day I was torturing myself over some other book I was trying to write, and I saw a little notebook on a shelf, and I thought, I wonder what that is. I sort of pulled it off and opened it up, and it was a diary that I'd been keeping while I was writing The Children's Bark. And it was full of the same torture, saying, why did I start this book? I've got all these characters, and I don't know what to do with them, and it's going to be boring, and I can't think of what to make them do and how to make the story have a shape. So I don't know. This is quite mysterious to me.
Mm-hmm. So from the less mysterious side, how did you come up with the children's book? Like, what were you trying to? What was your goal when you sat down pen to paper?
I didn't have a goal. I never have a goal. Did I have a goal? No, it's different with non-fiction. With non-fiction, you have a goal,
right? Because
the story already exists, and you've got to find a way to tell it. You've got to research it and tell it. But with fiction, I just started messing around.
Mm-hmm. Was it more need, like just I need to write?
Yeah, well, I'd like to be writing something, because otherwise between books I've always made a living out of freelance journalism. So, and there's nothing like freelance journalism to get you out of the house and get you away from the desk where you might be writing a novel, only you're not. And so it's like the most fantastic, what are they called? Displacement activity. They say, look, I'm having trouble with this. I think I'll go down to the morgue and stay down there for five days and write an article about that. But, I did, as the book goes on, what it's about this husband and wife who are apparently happily married, or they are, in fact, deeply married and devoted to each other. And they've got two kids, and one of the kids has what we would now call, he's on the autism spectrum. But when I wrote that book 40 years ago, this was not a term that people knew about. So these people I knew had this child, and nobody knew what was the matter with him. He was obviously developmentally delayed. And all the symptoms I could describe, like he screamed a lot, noise was insufferable to him, he couldn't speak. He was what we would now call profoundly autistic. He couldn't speak or be left alone. And the only thing that he could really do, and the only thing he had to communicate with, was singing. He had beautiful voice. He was only, when I first met him, only about 2 or 3, but he had an incredible memory for melody, and he could sing. He had this sweetest, purest, most lovely and exact singing voice, and he wanted to be sung to a lot, and he would sing all the time. You could hear him singing. But if an ambulance went past with a siren going, he would just become excruciated and scream and fling himself on the floor. So these people that I knew, who were friends of mine, they had this child. And when I realised that they had a child with this condition, I was kind of awestruck. I thought, how do you deal with something like this? He's never going to grow up and be a full person. He couldn't go to the toilet by himself, and he probably never would be able to. And I thought, how do you get from day to day if those are the cards you've been dealt? And how do you plan a future? How can you think how your life is going to be? And the people in question were very lovable and loving people. They were delightful people and funny and sweet. And I looked at them and I thought, how are you going to do this? And I saw their faithfulness to each other, and I saw how solid their relationship was. And I started, as soon as I start talking like this, it makes it sound like the book was some sort of intellectual project, something I was thinking, I see what I can do, I can take that and then I can do this to it. But it's not like that at all. It's just blundering from day to day. You know, I think, okay, I'll set them up, and then what will I do? Then I could get some less dependable type of person, a selfish person, a charming, selfish musician, say, somebody in a band, and I'll throw that into the mix. And I thought of other similar people that you actually could not depend upon for anything, and I thought I'd chuck them into the mix. And I didn't think it. I threw them into the mix and mixed it all around. And then, you know, at a certain point, I'm always amazed when I hear writers say, "Oh, and then the book just took over," and I was just like taking dictation. I always think, bullshit. I don't believe that, but it is true that the characters start to seem real, and so the way I sort of made them be real was I had this notebook. And I divided it up, you know, those college notebooks that have got the cardboard divisions, and so I gave each character a division. And every time anybody around me or that I saw on the bus or read something about did or said something that I thought would be appropriate to one of those people, I would file it away under that character's heading. And I always actually, if I'm talking to students, I always say, look, this is a really good idea. It really works. I don't know if anyone else has ever tried it on my advice, but they're very foolish not to, because it really does work. I mean, there are certain things that the character Dexter would think or say, and some of them I made up, and some of them I just heard someone saying in the street, and I go, hey, that's Dexter, and I'd write it down. And eventually I've got this big fat file full of fantastic material, and it's sort of real. It's not waffly stuff that I made up with an intellectual purpose. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, so when you started writing, and it's interesting to hear you talk about the things that you've made up, the things that you've, you know, sort of taken from the, you know, sort of the world around you, and things that are coming from real life. But autofiction was like not a thing when you started writing. Did people say autofiction? Did people talk about autofiction?
No, I'd never heard of it. No.
You know, so now that it is such a huge thing, you know, how do you think about your sort of like the way that your work references real life in the context of sort of all of this popularity around Rachel Cusk and, you know, just a variety of different people who are writing from their own lives and really like,
well,
you know,
I think everybody writes from their own lives. I just don't believe it that people go, I'm going to write a novel and it's going to be about a man who lives in Cleveland, and you've never been to Cleveland, and you think, okay, what job will he have? You know, do people think like that? I don't know if they do or not. But
this is my theory. Like, even hearing you unpack it, it's like, this is all from life. We all hear words.
Yeah, it's all from life. But, I mean, I'm sure that, a lot of the stuff that happens in this book, I invented. But it seemed to me to sort of, when I say invented, it sort of arose in my mind from everything I've ever thought or heard or experienced or seen. And the way I sort of tacked it together was mine.
So what makes you brave enough to say it? Like, I mean, like you said, I think that, you know, no book springs forth fully formed from an author's head, like Athena from the head of Zeus, right? No pun intended with Athena. But, you know, what allowed you so early on, before anyone else is doing it, to just be like, I am honestly writing about my own life and I'm fictionalizing it in a way that people just were very shy to do?
Well, we should maybe mention that my very first book, this is my third book, the children's book. The first one I wrote was called Monkey Grip, and it was basically straight from my personal life, and all the people in it were real, and I just changed their names. But you know the French filmmaker Truffaut, Francois Truffaut. I read an interview with him once, and he was talking about how he made characters in his films, and he said, I just take the woman in a blue dress and I give her a red dress. I thought, yes, that's the way you do it. You don't have to think up, their whole history back to when their ancestor was executed for murder in Australia. And I just met someone who had telling me a story. I'm sorry, she wasn't your relative, but she's got the same name. The first woman executed in Australia had the exact same name as Mary Ann, who's standing against the door. And she's trying to tell me it wasn't her great-great-great-grandmother. But anyway, let's get off the track. But yeah, look, I think that's got a lot, it's the whole thing about autofiction, I reckon it's got a lot to do with women, there being more women writing.
Right.
Because when I was at university, I never thought I'd write a novel. I thought I'd read thousands or hundreds or maybe dozens of novels, and I knew what a novel was, and we'd learnt, I'd learnt how to analyse one and see how it'd been put together, and it never crossed my mind that I would be able to do that. I thought, I don't know how do you do it? How did all those famous people? How did Tolstoy write that book? And it wouldn't have occurred to me to think I'll sit down and try to write a book like Tolstoy, or take it down a few levels, Jane Austen or some such. I never had an ambition to write one. Right. But I just thought writing was about the only thing that I knew I was any good at. Just tacking sentences together so they felt nice and looked good and sounded all right. And I didn't know what I was going to do with that, my only skill. That's why I did a lot of journalism as well, because I could make money out of that. In Australia, you can't really make money as a novelist. It's too small a place. But the thing about doing freelance journalism too is it puts you into situations that you couldn't otherwise get into, and where you can gratify a certain curiosity. You go into a lot of situations, you walk in with a notebook and say, oh, hi, I'm a journalist from the so-and-so, naming the local paper, and I'm just interested to find out about your work. And I used to think people would say, oh, go away, I'm too busy. But they'd say, oh, come in, sit down, because nobody believes that anyone's interested in their work. Right. They think they're terribly honoured and flattered that anyone's going to pay attention to their work. And so that was a wonderful thing I discovered, and it gave me lots of thoughts that I could use.
Yeah. So a couple of questions. So you just said, you can't make money as a novelist in Australia. It's too small, right? So these books, fiction or nonfiction, have largely existed in Australia. And so I asked you earlier, what does it mean to have, this work in another country? But what do you think it did for your writing to exist in a small place, to be read by a smaller community, and to have the space? You weren't on a global stage being, the reviews have been bonkers, and I'll talk about these bonkers, wonderful reviews in a minute. But that's pressure in and of itself when you're, in the prime of your career, when you're writing your first novel, your second novel, when you're trying to figure out how to get it done. It's a lot of pressure. What do you think it did or didn't do for you to not have to compete in that way for global attention?
Well, I don't know. Because you see, in Australia, when I published my first book, we were part of the British Empire publishing territory back then. So most Australians would want their book to be published in England, in London. But by the time I came along, little publishers had started to set up who were independent ones, and that's how I got published, because these two women set up a publishing house, and I thought I'd heard about it, and I was at university with them. That's how small it is, and I just kind of rocked up, and they liked it, and it went from there. But it's kind of, I'm not sure if the other Australian in the room will agree with me, but it has back then there was a rather mean-spirited feeling in the world, in the literary world of our country, And so when I published my first book, Monkey Grip, people sort of turned up. They were shocked, and they turned up their noses at it because it's full of sex and drugs, which wasn't like the done thing in Australia back then.
And probably done by men,
Jane.
if done. Done by men, if done.
Yeah, yes. And look, here's an interesting fact. I was once in later years on the judging panel of a prize in Australia, which is for somebody's first novel, an unpublished manuscript, the Vogel Prize. And I was a judge for 3 years, and the first 2 years, nearly all the entries. You had to be under 30 to enter. So the first 2 years, almost all the entries were by men. There were hardly any women who put in a novel to this prize. And then we changed the rule and we said, okay, let's make 35 the cut-off. And the third year, the women's entries flooded in. Mm-hmm. They were, and from that I learned, and I've found this to be true, that women tend to be late starters as writers or as artists, partly because it takes them a while to get up the nerve to do it, whereas men are kind of, and boys are kind of, they get out there and they charge into the world, and for good or ill. But women are sort of, oh gosh, I don't think, am I good enough? Well, nobody's going to like this. They'll say it's sentimental and, all those things. But then you get to 35 and you've been knocked around a bit, your marriage is broken up or you're a single mother or whatever, and life gets tough, mm-hmm. and you've got something to say. I think things change in those few years between 30 and 35 mm-hmm. is an enormous growth moment for women.
I felt that.
You did?
Between those ages. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Miserable to steady on my feet.
Yeah. So then, but then you publish a book in Australia and there's a certain type of review that you would get in Australia that's very kind of grudging. And, people say things like, Helen Garner talks dirty and passes it off as realism. That sort of tone. I got some good reviews as well, but you always remember the bad ones because you can see somebody sort of cleverly thought up this nasty thing to say, and it goes straight to your ego and wounds it.
Well, fast forward to the future where you've been called the mother of autofiction recently, which is incredible. Yeah. I think somebody said that they preferred This House of Grief to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood.
Where am I supposed to put myself?
There was a comment about being maybe a warmer, kinder Didion. Does that correct some of that nonsense from your early days?
I got over that nonsense after a while. I learned how not to take not to take notice of. Oh, I remember I did publish, my first book was published in America in a very small way. And you know that there's a column in the New Yorker that's called Briefly Noted? Well, it was mentioned in there, it was about that big. And it said something like, something that, a plain but limited talent. And I thought, oh, that was so deflating. I mean, but you just think, well, I don't know what else to do. I just keep writing and seeing what happens.
You are so much less petty than I am.
What would you do?
It's incredible. I would be twirling on my haters at this particular moment in time. I would be like photocopy copies of reviews and sending them to fools that said nonsense years in the past.
Well, I have to say that the guy who said Helen Garner talks dirty and passes it off as realism, which really shocked and wounded me because, in a sense it is a sort of an accurate description of my first book, and yet it was so spiteful. And so, but like it lodged in my flesh. And about 20 years later, I was invited to go to a regional university to give a lecture, in the honour of so-and-so. So by now I'm a bit of a big wheel. So I turn up in this town, and I find that the academic whose job it is to show me around Townsville or wherever it was the guy who'd written that review. And I thought, he was really a sweet guy, and I thought, oh, he's actually quite nice. But I thought, well, am I going to say anything or not? And he took me, we went for a swim in the surf, and we were talking and laughing and having a coffee, and he was showing me around town. I said, listen, something I've always wanted to say to you, and that is that you wrote a review of me that said Ramara, and I quoted, and he had the grace to blush. He went bright red, and he hung his head and he said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I apologise." I said, "Oh, it's okay." I said airily, having used it as a torture instrument for the last 20 years.
All right, that's the spirit. That's the spirit. So before we talk about this House of Grief, I want to talk transitionally. So we're publishing all these different books. We started with the children's book in this House of Grief. We're going to be publishing the Monkey Grip next, all of those. And then we're going to be doing the diaries, the collected diaries, as well as collected short stories. So I want to talk a little bit in the middle about Monkey Grip and your diaries, because I think there's a strong relationship that I think people are quite interested in between your habits as a diarist and your work as a novelist and writer. Can you talk a little bit about those diaries and when you started writing them and how that sort of morphs into something like Monkey Grip?
Yeah. Well, I always kept a diary when I was a girl. When I was a teenager, I kept those boring teenage diaries that you burn when you go to college in case your mother finds them. And so I burnt that. It was the first great burning incident. And I got rid of them. But then I didn't keep any diaries for quite some years. And then when I got married and became a mother, and then after that, after my first marriage broke up and I started living in sort of big, communal hippie houses, in the 70s in Melbourne with other single mothers, and it was fabulous. That was really one of the happiest decades of my life, I think. So I was writing, I wrote a diary all the time then, but it was the kind of diary that was really... Well, I always think of writing a diary as practice. It's writing practice. You do it every day, and you don't just whack it down. You write as well as you can, and practice making sentences that are graceful and shapely and have some power. And so I went on doing that for quite some years, and I still do it now. But then at a certain point, I got involved with this guy who was a heroin addict. This is back in the 70s. And it was obviously a painful relationship, and it was obviously going to end badly, and it did. Nobody died, but it ended sadly. And when I was about, I was still living that, and I was writing about it every day. And after, I guess looking back, I was about 3/4 of the way through that relationship at the time that it lasted, which was about 2 years. And I thought, I think this is actually a story. It's actually, I could feel it coming round in a curve. And what I've discovered recently, subsequently, is that I think that people talk a lot about form in writing and structure. But I've got this very simple idea, which is that a story is a piece of life with a bend in it. And that's about all you need, really. You don't have to have all this kind of carpentry and towers and balconies looking out and all that kind of thing. This is kind of primitive, I suppose. Anyway, so back then I could see that this story was coming round in a curve. And I thought, well, maybe when I get to the end of it. So I took it down to the library, to the State Library, while my daughter was at school every day. And I'd take the interesting bits out of the diary and I'd laboriously copy them out by hand into another exercise book. And that was the one I thought of as maybe I might be able to show it to someone. Mm-hmm. I didn't really think maybe it's a novel. I just thought I could show this to someone because I was taking out all the sloppy, boring crap that was up the front. And so eventually that's what happened. And he and I split up and, everyone was broken-hearted and the rest of it. I thought, well, that looks like the end. So then I took it to these two women who'd started this publishing house, and I said, look, I don't know what this is, but maybe it might be a book. And so they said, we'll leave it with us. And so, because I got on my bike and I'm riding home and I'm thinking, by the time I get home, they will have rung up. But anyway, a couple of weeks later, they got in touch with me and said that they thought it was, in fact, a book and they would like to publish it. So how did I get onto this subject?
Because we were talking about your diaries.
Oh, yeah.
The relationship
okay.
to
All right. So the book comes out and it's published and heaps of people buy it, so that was great. But then all the critics got going on it and they said, look at this, she's just published her diaries. It's obviously just a diary. And I, at that point, was saying, how outrageous. How can you make such a suggestion? this is a novel, it's fiction. And I don't know if they believe me or not, but anyway, so it went on existing, and people went on buying it and reading it for several, I was going to say generations, that might be exaggerating a bit. So I'm still keeping the diary, right? So at a certain point, I think I'm going to dump some of these diaries. I've got so many exercise books, I'm going to burn them. So I started burning them. I burned all the ones that Monkey Grip was based on, in case you're wondering, and they're all gone, consumed by flames in my backyard.
I didn't realise you burned those.
Yeah, I burnt them. Well, I mean, really, they were just awful. I mean, all the bits that I cut out that weren't in the book, they were just embarrassing.
Right.
And okay, several decades passed, and I published a whole lot of other stuff. And my publisher says to me, why don't you publish your diaries? And I go, don't be ridiculous. He says, no, really, why don't you? Have a look and see if you think you could. So I go back, and they're really boring for quite a long time. And then at a certain point, where I went to live in Paris for a year, they suddenly got more interesting. And they weren't about whinging and moaning about my love affairs, and they were about other things in the outside world a bit more, as well as about my life.
Right.
So I burnt the rest of them up to that point. So I burnt them up to the year 77. And so those are the ones that I started to look at. Right. And I thought, oh, yeah, this stuff's okay. If I edit it, this really drastically edit it, it could be interesting to other people.
They are.
So that's what I did. And so I got 3 volumes out of them. And those are the last 3 things that I've published. I mean, the most recent things are the 3 books of diaries.
And those may be the last things that we publish in the grand Helen Garner project, but they are not least. They are stunning. And stunning is everything. So that brings me to your nonfiction. So how do you attack doing nonfiction versus fiction? I mean, you sort of, all of it sort of feels like it comes from the same generative place. You're looking, you're engaging, you're in the world, and then you're putting pen to paper. But are your sentences different? Is your process different? You know, this House of Grief is obviously many years in the making of a trial, but could you talk a little bit about it, not just as the book and the trial, but also as the trying to figure out what the story you're trying to tell is, how to tell it?
Yeah, well, I didn't know. This man was charged with, a man who drove his kids into the dam. He was charged on 3 counts of murder. But it was a kind of trial, it was circumstantial in the sense that there was no bit of proof that he'd actually done it on purpose. And there was an enormous amount of technical stuff in the court, like measurement by the police who go to terrible car crashes and see where are the tracks, and did he swerve? Could he have been steering the thing? Or, he said he had a coughing fit and blacked out and the car just went into the dam. And it was very hard for... His wife stuck by him, the mother of the dead boys, stuck by him right through the first trial where he was found guilty. He appealed and was given a second trial. And by the time the second trial came around, she'd changed her mind. And now she was insane with rage and grief. Not insane, but a fire. She was the witness from hell. And it was very hard for them to control her in the court. She would scream, she would throw things on the floor, and she was an uncontrollably grieving, maddened mother. And so this whole process went on for 7 years, because he had 2 trials, 2 appeals. Then he tried to go to the High Court and they wouldn't hear him. So then he got 33 years and went to jail, and that's where he is now. And the wife is also dead. She died on the anniversary of the boys' deaths. So you can see it's a kind of, by the time, I sat through all these and took notes and thought about it for all this time. And there's no way that I could start. I kept copious accounts. I had a kind of special journal that was devoted to the project. And every day I'd get home from court and I'd write down in a coherent way, not just notes, what I'd seen that day and what I thought about it, how it struck me, how I felt, because my feeling about whether he was guilty or not swung around a lot according to what witness had spoken that day. And so by the end of 7 years and he's in jail, now I've got these notebooks here and I don't know how the hell am I going to tell this story because it's so big and so excruciatingly painful and so terrible. So I thought, well, am I going to take the major decision you're making in that point is, are you going to tell it in first person or are you going to pretend to be a sort of a God figure that sort of hovers above the story and knows the outcome before it starts? And I just knew immediately that I couldn't do that. I didn't know how to do that. It didn't suit my nature or my experience as a writer. So I sort of built myself into it. And the bit that I read out, you know, when I described the bloke and his situation, and then I said, I saw it on TV. And that's the moment where I step into the story and I'm going to be the voice that's going to tell you what happened, and I'm going to tell you what happened in the court, and I'm going to tell you how I felt about it, but trying to keep myself back. But I tried to... I wanted the reader to come into the story with me as it grew and as it developed. I didn't want to say, well, here's the story, I've made it into a nice shape and I'll put it down and you can read it and I'll just back out of here. I wanted the reader to feel those fluctuations of horror and sudden pity and all the things that go through your mind when you're watching something so terrible.
It's a manageable book, despite how unmanageable the subject matter is. How did you do that? Like, it's a book I love, right? It's not a book that I recoil from. It's about 3 dead children, do you know what I mean? And a murder, ostensibly. What tools do you employ to make that possible for the reader? I think we're all so shy about reading about things that pain or grieve us. Yeah. And this isn't scary. You know, it's like, I think people really have a rigorous not a joyful experience of reading, but like a rigorous intellectual engagement with it. Yeah. Like they feel bigger, they learn something about the world, about...
Yeah, well, that's what happened to me. I mean, if you're the person watching a trial and you get to know all the people and it goes on for 7 years and you know who the only people you don't see again and again are the different juries that are... But in a sense... It's like turning yourself into a member of a jury to watch a trial. You've got to think like a juror. You've got to think, well, do I believe him? Is he telling the truth? Or is... it's a really strange experience, but it's kind of wonderful. And I felt in this enormous privilege to be there and to see... to witness people suffering right in front of my face day after day. And I got to know a few of them. I didn't interview people for this book. I mean, if I'd been writing an article, I would have, in a magazine or something, I might have, gone and tried to get other people's view or sort of dig into the story through what they told me. But outside the court in Melbourne, there's this coffee cart where you can get a really good espresso, and everybody goes to that cart. The judges go there, the lawyers go there, the police go there, the technical witnesses go there, the crooks go there, the people who haven't been tried yet, the people whose son has just been sent away for 20 years goes to that coffee cart. And so there's this seething kind of area of what? I don't know what you would call it, all sorts of adrenaline and grief and fear and the laughter of relief and the sort of laughter that people who do that sort of work have to engage in order not to go nuts like cops. And so I used to go there every day, and the grandparents of the dead children would go to this coffee cart, and they were just ordinary couple from the country, just a sort of little farming town, and they say, "Oh, g'day, what's your name? Well, I've seen you in court. What are you here for? Are you a journalist?" And I'd have to say, "Well, no, I'm not a journalist," which means that I have to say why I've got a notebook, and that's the embarrassing bit. But, see, why are you perving on our story? But I don't know, God got close to them, and it's comforting for them to be able to talk to someone else who knows the whole story, and they don't have to explain it, what they're going through, because I'm somebody who's witnessed the whole thing. It's almost like you can gossip about it. That sounds really weird, but when something frightful like that happens and you're part of it, witnessing it, you're actually, before you even start to write, you're a useful person, because they can come up to you and say, what did you think of that witness? I mean, that's bullshit, isn't it? And that kind of conversation you can have. So it's just a matter of being near it and really, really, really observing and not forgetting anything, and rush home at the end of the day and write it down in a coherent way.
Well, what's the impact on you of writing over this many years, something so difficult? And making, trying to translate comfort to other humans that are there, to the reader.
Well, if you write well, if you can write well enough, that in itself can make something bearable. I mean, bearable to the reader, not to the person who's the sufferer. But, that's one thing that art's for, isn't it? It's to make the awfulness of life bearable, to help us to bear things. That's why music exists and why poetry exists, because they can take what the excruciating pain of being a human being and shape it into something that you can bear. And so, writing the book, I didn't want to write anything that would cause any of the people in the story to suffer any more than they already had. And that's the scary part. I wrote another book about a young woman who murdered her boyfriend, and I got to know the boyfriend's parents, and that was the first book of that kind I wrote. And when I'd finished it, I knew that if Maria and Nino, his parents, didn't like it, I wouldn't publish it. Right. I didn't take any money for it. I thought, I'm going to do the best I can with this book, and I'm trying to handle this horrible grief and pain that they've gone through. So I just took it up to them. I said, look, here it is. I didn't say, if you don't like it, I won't publish it. I just said, here it is, and I went home. And they got in touch with me, a couple of weeks later and said, yes, we like it. And that was the first story I tried to tell, where I could see that the pain that people were in was so terrible you could hardly find words for it.
Yeah. Where does this instinct to connect come from? Right, the empathy, the thoughtfulness of the bravery to tell your own story, warts and all, to wade into this house of grief, to build with these folks. I mean, how do you? Where does that come from? Is it from teaching?
I'm just really interested. That reminds me of something. When I got friendly with one of the homicide detectives in this case, and I remember one time one of the accused man's sister, who was terribly loyal to him, she would look at me. She'd give me these terrible looks, and I sort of didn't know where to put myself, because they sensed that I wasn't as sympathetic to him as they were. And I said to this cop, I said, gee, his sister's giving me these terrible death stares. And he said, welcome to my world. But the other thing was, I said to him, I noticed that he could sit. You've probably noticed that I wriggle around a lot in my chair. Well, when he's in the court, this cop, he would sit just like I'm sitting now. He'd sit completely still for hours and hours and hours without moving or twitching or blowing his nose or pushing his hair out of the way, or he had a buzz cut anyway because he was a cop. But I said to him once, Jared, I notice that when you're in the court, you just sit really still and you don't really move much. I said, how come? He said, oh, well, I'm just really interested. And I thought that was actually quite a profound reply, because he'd arrested the guy, and he'd been doing, it was of vital interest to him what was happening in the court, and so I think that's my answer. I'm just really interested.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in what people do and what they feel about it afterwards.
But the bravery of the sharing, I think, is like why you do it. I get, but how do you share? Like it's a lot. It's a lot of giving.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm thinking a lot about your teaching years and this like instinct to connect always. Like everything you've ever done seems like it's whether it's writing or living, it's about connection.
Yeah, I guess I never thought of that. Yeah. Well, I do. It is important to me to write in such a way that just about anybody could read it. I mean, I don't want to write books that are too hard for some people to read, and I get furious when I can't understand a book. It really enrages me. I mean, obviously there are some books I can't understand because I'm too ignorant, like philosophy and things like that, but and science. But I want to be communicated with. I want a two-way thing, and I really want to know what people think, why they do things, and what they think about it, and do they suffer from guilt like I do?
Right.
And yeah, those things interest me greatly.
It's enormously human. Everything, that you've written is enormously human, which is sort of the brilliant thing about them. One thing that, looking at this House of Grief in the children's book and Monkey Grip to some degree, a lot of it is about fissures inside of personal relationships. A lot of the origins, right? Like it's like Farquharson wouldn't have done anything if it hadn't been for this massive being left by his wife, right?
Yeah.
The Bohemian comes into this solid traditional family. Things get ruptured. Monkey Grip, people coming together and coming apart. I'm curious about sort of what your thoughts on exploring these interpersonal relationships, the romantic in particular, and the kind of grief, the kind of friction that comes out of those relationships.
Well, you asked me before what I felt about looking at these books years later, and I'd like to say that when I published the diaries, it was excruciating to look at what an idiot I had been as a younger woman. Really, that was really awful, and I thought to myself, well, okay, I'm publishing these diaries. What's the point of cutting out all the bits that... I mean, I don't think I'm the only person who betrays someone who loves me or all the things, all the crimes that one commits, big and small. And I thought, well, I'll just risk it. I'll just leave it in. I'll put it in. And I won't take out the bits that make me look really bad. So that's why I burnt the other ones, so that no one would see how bad that I was back in those years. I mean bad. I just mean boring and stupid. Okay, I'm reading along in the diary, and I come to some passage of self-righteous defensiveness about what somebody's done to me, and I think, I can't put that in. That makes me look really pathetic and bitchy. And I think, well, I'm going to put it in. Anything that gave me that feeling, right. I put it in. I made myself put it in. Right. And God, did I. Oh, my God. When the books were published, I lay in bed at night under this kind of cataract of self-loathing and disgust with myself and thinking, how could I have done this? What's going to happen to me? Everyone's going to hate me. And really, I mean, it was just awful. I couldn't sleep for months. And then the books came out and people started writing me and saying, this could be my life. They said, this could be... And the last of the three books is about my rather catastrophic third marriage and really just so humiliating and awful. But to my amazement, all these women wrote to me and said, that marriage could be my marriage.
Listen.
And I wanted to write back and say, why are you still in it?
I love that book.
But I
read it at clutch time for myself.
But, that's the question I ask myself in a lot of the things that are in the diary. I think, why did you do that? Why did you go on doing that? Why didn't you just say, okay, that's it, I'm out of here? But you don't. And so just the... I guess I figure that we... Zadie Smith said a wonderful thing in an essay of hers that I loved. And she was talking about the whole, identity problem and who's allowed to write, if you're allowed to write a black character if you're white and things like that. And she said, I think that what connects us is our griefs. And I was thunderstruck when I read that. I thought it was really the most wonderfully human and liberating and comradely thought. And it really made me filled me with respect for her, which I already had. But I figure that I'm not unique.
Right.
Well, I know I'm not unique in these regards, that the things that I've done or endured have been done and endured by just about everyone on the planet. And so when one person fesses up, everyone else feels better.
Yeah. Well, you are unique in your brilliance and your warmth. But I need to move us along to some questions from the audience because I have talked to you for too long. So I'm going to stop you there, and
Okay.
I'm going to ask you all to use a mic because we're recording for the live stream. So you will, even if you can project, I ask that you use the mic. Any questions? Who's brave like Helen?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, do.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say I studied you at uni, and when you said about Monkey Grip coming out and your first book's coming out, and who wants to read about this, we grabbed it. I have books from my friends that say, "Here's for you. This is lovely, Helen," and everything. It was so important to women living in Glebe and Newtown and inner city Sydney, when they came out. So thank you. Your voice.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
But I actually reread Children's Bark when I saw it was being republished, and you write about eventlets, which is a word that, you're talking about Athena and Philip are walking around looking at people and analysing eventlets. And I realised that, and everywhere I look, you collect eventlets.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know about how you use those eventlets to make something bigger, because I think that they're beautiful.
That word.
I loved it.
An eventlet.
Yeah.
Did I invent that? Did you ever see it anywhere else?
Never
I
seen
hope
it
I
anywhere
invented
else.
it.
It jumped off the page.
Yeah, well, actually, that's really interesting because it reminds me of something. Back in the 2000s, I got a job in the local newspaper. The Age is the big newspaper in Melbourne, and they asked me if I wanted to write a weekly column. And I thought, well, I didn't have a job, so I said, okay. And it was called, the title of the column was This Life. And I thought, well, that gives me open slather. I can write about anything under that heading. And I had to write, the word limit every week was 774 words. And so I thought, and I know what sub-editors are like, I thought I am going to file a piece every week that is exactly 774 words long, and nobody is going to cut my copy. So I did that, and I started doing it. It was a lot of fun, and I found that I could. At the beginning, I thought, I better open a file in my filing cabinet that will be called Ideas. And I think I had one idea, and I put it into the file. And then when I went to get the idea out to write about it, it was as dead as a doornail. I mean, I forget what it was, just some ridiculous observation I'd made. So I thought, I'm going to have to do this on the spur of the moment. I'm going to have to write it the night before, and not turgidly kind of come up with, I can't stand it when people have a column and they start off, it's that time of year again, the leaves are falling, and you just want to go, no! But so, anyway, I started writing, and I became a grandmother around about the same time, so that gave me plenty of things to write about. And I did for about 2 years, and I was at a wedding, a family wedding, and a woman I didn't know came up to me and she said, "Oh, Helen, I've been reading your columns." She said, "They really surprised me." She said, "A little bit of nothing, and suddenly there's a story." And at first I thought, how dare you? And then I thought, that's the best compliment I've ever received in my life. And it's an eventlet, because the tiniest thing, if you write it down, if you pay attention to it, you can get something out of it. There's almost nothing that happens that doesn't lead anywhere or give you some sort of pleasure or surprise. And so I thought that she'd not only... I was just rocked when she said it. It must have taken me probably a day to realise that she had just articulated my artistic credo. And I was really grateful to her. And her name was Noga. And I didn't see her again for years. And one time, recently I ran into her this time at a funeral, and I rushed over and said, Noga, I've got to tell you something about something you said to me years ago. And she said, what? What did I say? With this sort of terrified look. I said, no, you said the best compliment. And I'm so grateful to her for sort of articulating it. Because I don't know what I'm going to write, and I'm on the train, and I see a boy doing something ludicrous and another boy doing something ludicrous, and it's got no particular meaning. But if you get a hold of it and you write it down, and while you're writing it down, other thoughts come to you, and suddenly you've got a little story, and it's got a bend in it, like I was saying at the beginning.
Absolutely.
We have a question over here.
Oh, terrific.
So when you said you betrayed somebody you loved, did you do it on purpose or by happenstance?
Well, it's not like I only did it once. I don't think I have ever betrayed anybody on purpose to hurt them. But I might have done it just because I had to get out of there. You know, I mean, it wasn't going so well, or it was a relationship that had no future, and well, it depends what betray means, of course, doesn't it? I mean, if just to say to somebody, look, I don't love you anymore and I want us to split up, I wouldn't call that a betrayal unless there was a marriage and children and promises had been made. But how do we get onto this subject? Yeah, betraying someone, but I think lying to people, I think lying is betrayal. And everybody tells lies, little lies every day, but big lies and big purposeful lies that are, or withholding of information from someone who really is owed that information. I would call that betrayal. And I don't think I've done all that much of that sort. What about you? You don't have to answer that.
Oh, I did once.
Yeah.
I did once.
And you still feel badly about it years later?
Oh, yeah, because of lack of courage.
That's another reason for betrayal, isn't it? Just you lose your nerve, or you can't tell the truth. It's got to...
Right. I didn't say I don't love you anymore.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to hurt people, do you? And we don't really want to go around hurting people on purpose. But I remember my sister said to me once, you can't raise children without damaging them. And I was really shocked when she said that, but it's true, I think. I mean, you can't relate to other people without hurting them. It's not... I think it's a fantasy. Actually, that's the sort of fantasy I was trying to write about in this book about the guy who drove his kids into the dam. People who supported him, who knew him before, many of them turned against him when they heard the evidence. But people kept saying, but he loved those boys. He loved those boys, as if that meant he would never hurt them or want to hurt them or want to... And I thought that's a kind of fantasy about what love is. I think love goes right to the absolute depths of people and stirs it up. And down there are all the damages that have been done to you in all your life, and the little pains, big and small, of childhood. They're all down there. And when you fall madly in love with someone, or deeply in love, that part of you gets like exposed to light and air and movement, and pain comes out. And so we can't love each other without hurting each other. That's what I think. So I don't think you should feel that bad about it.
That was very moving. Thank you.
I had a question. You mentioned that your book about a child with autism was written many years ago.
Yeah, in the early 80s.
And we didn't know all that much about.
Did you say we did or we didn't?
We did not
No.
know them, and we tended to blame mothers.
That's right.
We called them refrigerator
That's right.
mothers,
Yep.
who were responsible for. Was that part of the reason you wrote that book, was to confront that?
No,
feelings?
because I didn't know anything about it either. The people, my friends who had the autistic child, we didn't, the word autism sort of hadn't been, well, I mean, I think it probably been invented within the depths of psychological thinking, but most people walking around the street had never heard the word before. And I didn't know it, but I could see, I wanted to. See, there's the whole theme of music that runs through the book. I mean, that's why it's called The Children's Bach, because that's the name of a piano book for children, learning how to play simple pieces of Bach on the piano. Everybody in the book has got some special thing about music in their life. And the little boy was probably the most musical of them all, because he didn't even know what music was. He just opened his mouth and out came this sweet sound like a bird singing. But no, I guess for the purposes of the book, the boy's condition was, it could have been any sort of serious troubling condition that wasn't going to get better. And I wanted the family to be, as it were, imprisoned by that. And I wanted to figure out if that prison, of which is a prison born of decency and duty and all the feelings that we always hope that we'll have towards people who are helpless. It made me curious to think what would happen if I mixed in those sort of louche rock and roll sort of characters.
We have time for one final question. Or Lisa, would you like to wrap things up?
See if anyone has a question. I don't want.
Hi. So I agree with Lisa. I think you're a really brave writer, and part of it is that you have such a strong personal voice. And I know you said you don't know how else to write, but the reader attaches him or herself to you, and you're very open in letting us do that because you share all kinds of things. And that was especially true for me in reading the 2 criminal law books, was that it was a fabulous way to experience the journey, was through you. You've gotten really close to subjects, though, and I'm thinking in particular of The Spare Room. And I wonder if you could talk about that book, which is available more readily in the U.S.
From Echo.
And it's brilliant, and it's very much about friendship as well as
Yeah,
being
well,
about
that you could call
illness.
that a book about betrayal. Some people might. Oh well, just briefly, The Spare Room. It's a novel, but once again, it's very closely based on things that happened in my own life. I had a friend who had terminal cancer, but she was, I suppose you would say she was an old hippie. She was, my age, and then when all this happened, she would have been about, 60s, mid-60s. And she was so afraid of dying that she simply refused to acknowledge how serious her cancer was. And she was sort of tricked into spending a huge amount of money on these bogus cures that was, there's this shyster of a doctor in Melbourne. So she lived in Sydney and I lived in Melbourne. She gets in touch with me and says, listen, Hel, can I come and stay with you for 3 weeks because I'm going to go and do a treatment at this such and such clinic in the middle of town. I go, of course you can come, because I loved her. She was a dear friend. And anyway, she turns up. I hadn't seen her for quite some months. I knew she was very sick, but I didn't know. I thought the cancer probably was going to be terminal, but she hadn't said it because she didn't believe it. Anyway, she turns up, and she's way, way sicker than I knew she was going to be. but she was refusing to acknowledge that she was in pain. Anyway, so I take her down to the clinic, and I mean, an ordinary person walks into that clinic and all your alarm bells go off. You go, this is shonky. These people, I won't go into the detail, but it's worth reading the book for the detail. But they gave her these ludicrous treatments, like they'd put her into a big box with her head sticking out the top, and they'd pump all this steam into it, and I forget what else, just treatment. And she was paying $3,000 a week for this. And she'd go in there every day, and she'd come out at the end of the day in what they call rigors, like this. She couldn't move or walk, and I'd get her home and I'd put her into bed, and she, but she was always smiling. She'd say, "Oh, these treatments are going to have the cancer on the run by the middle of next week, and Helen, you've got to believe in it, because I don't want, if I can keep my belief, and you can help me keep my belief, that's going to help her, this cancer. I can defeat this cancer." And she'd be in such pain in the night. She'd be groaning with pain, and she wouldn't take any painkillers. I think she'd got Panadol or something like that. And I'd go in and say, "What is it? What can I do for you?" She'd say, "Oh, I think there's a draft going. I've got a terrible pain in my neck. I think there's a draft coming through the window." And so I'd get a hot water bottle and I'd rug her up and I'd do all the things. And I'd say, "Look, tomorrow we've got to get you some morphine. You're in pain that's so extreme that this can't go on." No, I won't do it. And so she drove me out of my mind with rage and grief. I was in such a state. Finally, I took her to a doctor. I forced her to go to a doctor, and they did a scan, and it turned out that one of her vertebrae had been completely devoured and replaced by tumour. So the only thing holding her spine up was a big lump of tumour, and still she would not accept it. And I didn't, you see, when I talk about betrayal, I couldn't stand it, because she'd come out every morning hobbling, hardly able to walk, with this big smile on her face. And on one morning, I just sort of went berserk, and I yelled and screamed at her, and I said, "Get that smile off your face or I'll wipe it off." And I mean, I did things like that, and I'm not that sort of person. I don't think I am. Am I, Abby? But on one occasion, I yelled at her and roared, and we're both crying, and she cried, and all her defences on that day dropped. And after a while, she said to me, "Death's at the end of this, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, darling, it is. I'm really sorry, but it is." And she just somehow, into the room, flowed this current of something beautiful. She sat there we just sat on the back veranda and in the sun, and it's kind of, for that moment, she acknowledged that she was going to die. And we just sat together, and then we talked about what we'd make for dinner, and it became real for a moment. Next morning, she wakes up and she's back in the same thing. So finally, I just couldn't. Oh, she went and had surgery on her neck, and then of course she attached everything to the doctor. And, "Oh, Dr. John, oh, he's so marvellous, and I'm going to stay with you for another 3 weeks." And I just said, "Look, I'm sorry, I can't do it. I can't go on. You'll have to go home. You have to go home to your family. I can't do it anymore." And she, I mean, I don't know if it was a betrayal. I suppose it was a betrayal of sorts. But she became very dignified. She said, all right, I know what I'll do. I'll check myself into some crazy little hotel." And she talked like that. Anyway, she went home and she died. And I did see her. Yeah, about a week before she died, she was back in the state of, "I'm not going to die. No, I'm going to get better. I'll be better next week. And I'm just going to take these pills," some ridiculous bullshit pill that some hippie doctor had given her. And it was a horrible experience. It was probably the worst 3 weeks of my life. And I don't know if it was a betrayal or not to yell and scream at her. Some of the critics of the book said, how could someone say, "Get that smile off your face or I'll wipe it off"? And people were horrified by it. But those were the only moments of truth that existed between us, was when we fought and bitterly fought and screamed at each other. I don't know how I got onto that subject.
Spare room.
How did I?
We were talking about the spare room.
Yeah.
But, you know, the one thing, on that note, we'll close, but I just want to say that the way that all of you were just raptly listening to Helen talk about her friend and that time and that book, if you haven't read her yet, there's no universe in which you don't feel those ways when you're reading these pages. So I hope you will read The Spare Room. I hope you will read This House of Grief. I hope you will read the children's book, Monkey Grip, the diaries, the short stories, everything she's ever written, because she is a global treasure. And I'm just so pleased that we get to spend this time with you. So this concludes Helen Takes America.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
Right.
Yeah, I heard one at least.